Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. In our warp speed online culture, today's trending topic is often tomorrow's forgotten hashtag. Not so with MeToo, an expression of understanding and solidarity from women to women, driven by a determination to expose the truth about sexual violence. Well, my guest today, Tarana Burke, first coined that phrase, Me Too, long before the Harvey Weinstein case. And she continues to reach out to marginalised women and girls. But what difference has that Me Too movement made to the bigger picture? Tarana Burke, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you for having me.
I want to begin with those two words, Me Too. It was a phrase, as I said, you coined it long before Harvey Weinstein, before the Me Too went viral. Did you feel in a way you lost control of that phrase?
Well, I thought, in the first days when Me Too went viral, it was very nerve-wracking for a person like me. I was not known, I wasn't in the spotlight, and so I thought that it would be lost. I thought its original cause would be lost and its purpose. And I think it took a very short period of time for me to realize that this was sort of an evolution of what I started and not necessarily it being lost. So I shifted quickly from the nerves to seeing an opportunity.
The actress who I think put the hashtag on it and originated that sort of 2017 viral phenomenon was Alyssa Milano. And
yes.
She says she wasn't aware that you had used this phrase with regard to your activism on the sexual violence issue for years beforehand.
Right.
Did you then talk to her to find out exactly what happened and how she came upon this phrase?
Yes, she reached out to me. She was made aware pretty quickly after she put the tweet out, and she reached out to me within 24, 48 hours to say, I didn't know, and I'm so excited to meet you. And then she tweeted it out to her followers that this is the person who originated the phrase, and she put my, our website up and things like that. And then we started a friendship.
Because the big difference, I suppose, is that post the Weinstein allegations hitting the newspapers in October 2017, many of the women who spoke out were really pretty high-profile, well-known, well-connected women. Yeah. Your work, of course, which we can trace back to the 1990s, was mostly with disadvantaged women in communities very, very far from the public eye. So there was a real fundamental difference.
Absolutely.
Did you, in a sense, feel that your point was being lost there?
So, like I said, it was an evolution of it. And so my point was to support survivors. We started out with Black and brown girls in the Deep South in the United States. And those girls had gone through very similar things to the grown women who had come forward in the Weinstein case. And so the beauty, I think, and the magic of Me Too is that it's a unifier in that way. And it's where survivors find community. And so the mainstream media kept the focus on, the actresses and Hollywood and that idea. But at its core, the women who came forward were really no different than those girls who I served in the communities 10 years before.
Well, interesting. The only difference really is that, frankly, wider society seemed to engage more with the experiences of the well-connected and the high-profile than they did with the sort of voices you were reporting on.
Absolutely.
And that seems to me an area where there might be a good deal of resentment on your part.
No, let me tell you what I feel. This is not resentment. This is what I've experienced. And I think most people who look like me have experienced a similar thing. We have been socialized to respond to and to pay attention to rich, white, wealthy, famous people in general, and particularly these women. But I don't blame the women for that. I blame the media for that. I blame the media who will constantly, these women are survivors and they came forward to tell their stories. And even though other people, if you think about it, the people who made Me Too go viral weren't those people. The people that made Me Too go viral were everyday folks, millions from around the world who got online and told their truth. And we've built this movement on the backs of those people, but we don't get to hear those people's stories.
Indeed. And before we get to sort of the fallout from the Weinstein case, I do want to actually focus on the work you've been doing for years.
Wonderful.
Because you have this capacity, it seems, to sit down with women, and indeed girls as well, and get them to discuss and listen to their stories in ways that others haven't. And you open them up and get their truth. How do you do it?
I don't think that it's like magic. I think there's so many people, and again, this is not just for women and girls. People who have survived sexual violence in general are so many of us are shamed into silence that there aren't very many spaces where we can open up, where we can tell our stories, where we can reveal our truth. That when you provide that opportunity or create that community, people are eager to do that. Once Me Too went viral, what I saw when Me Too went viral is the same thing I saw when I went into community centers and did workshops with smaller numbers of people, is that people want to be seen, they want to be heard, and they want to be believed.
You're a New Yorker.
I am.
I think one of the most shocking experiences you had, just from recollecting a memory you had of it, was sitting down with a bunch of girls in Selma, Alabama.
Yes.
And I think you asked them to raise their hands if they had had an experience of sexual violence. And you could not believe how many in that room.
So we never ask people to raise their hands publicly. Let me tell you how it happens. Because we don't want people to out themselves if they're not comfortable, we ask folks to write it down.
Right.
And so in this instance, we've given all the girls a sheet of paper after the workshop and said, give us 3 things you learned at this workshop. And if you're so inclined, write Me Too at the bottom of the page if you're a survivor and if you want help. And so we collected those papers and went back to the hotel room. And when I dumped them out and began to read one after another, after another, after another, it was shocking how many, really the majority of the room, had an experience with sexual violence. And it's something that I had seen over and over again. But seeing it in writing, in paper was just, it was definitely shocking.
Do you think it would be pretty much the same experience today?
Absolutely.
So in that sense, we're going to talk a lot about what Me Too has achieved, but it hasn't changed that much on that sort of systemic structural level.
No, but we're dealing with something that is centuries old. We're dealing with an epidemic that has been affecting people around the world since the beginning. It's biblical, right? And so there's no way that a hashtag going viral 2 years ago is going to dismantle structures and systems in such a short period of time. What we've done is we've opened up the space to talk about it in ways that we haven't been able to talk about it, and to say this is not about individuals, this is about systems and about structures, and this is the pathway forward.
Do you think there is a race issue here as well? That the voices of black girls and women are not heard in a way that the voices of white females in the United States are?
Oh, I think it's a race issue. I think it's a gender issue. I think it's a sexuality issue. I think marginalized people, as usual, are the last voices that we hear. And so you have stories about black and brown women, stories about queer and trans people, about disabled folks that never rise to the top, that never get the attention.
So coming back to the Weinstein case, and I should make it quite clear that we're talking while the jury is deliberating. We do not know which way the verdict is going to go in the Weinstein case, but nonetheless it has raised all sorts of interesting questions. Here's what one black woman activist, whom I know you know very well, April Raine, has said about the Weinstein case. She said, "White women have not been as supportive as they could have been of women of color, and that is one lesson that we can take away from the fallout from the whole Harvey Weinstein situation." Do you sympathize with that?
You know, I think that there's always been this schism between, you know, white feminists, black feminists, particularly online, right? There was a fallout when MeToo went viral about it, and a lot of black women felt not seen and not heard in that moment because of this long history. And so I think there's a lot for white women and non-black women women who are white women to learn about how to help amplify the voices of those who don't often get heard, which is women of color, black women in particular.
It does raise questions about the way in which the response has been targeted on personal stories. And it's not just Weinstein, because that hit the media in October 2017. Yeah. After that, there were a host of other famous men who then faced allegations of, at the very least, inappropriate and sometimes outright sexually violent behaviors.
Yeah.
But they were all told as sort of personal narratives. You followed those stories very closely, but your message appeared to be, let us not get too involved in the personal, in the private, because this is a much deeper structural question.
You know, at some point, at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, I felt like I was playing whack-a-mole. Every week there would be a new accusation and a new person in the media, and all of the attention would be on whoever this next person was. And we would never hear about the survivor and what happened with the survivor or what happens in their lives. But we also didn't look at the systems around those people that allowed it to happen. Right? We can talk about Harvey Weinstein ad nauseum, but we also have to talk about what are the structures that were in place that allowed a Harvey Weinstein to thrive. If you're going to talk about Harvey Weinstein's being successful, then we have to also talk about capitalism, right? Because it's the love of money and the desire for people to have money and what he represented. The bottom line is people valued those things more than they valued the humanity of the women that he was really destroying their lives.
It's about power.
It's about power and it's about privilege. At the end of the day, these are the two things that we have to talk about dismantling. These are not individuals, it's the power and privilege that they hold.
And I should say, as I've already indicated, we're speaking before the jury has returned a verdict. Of course, Harvey Weinstein categorically denies all the charges he faces, and that's important that I put that out there at this particular point in the legal process. Let us look at a few of the concrete steps that have been taken by a number of states in the US over the last couple of years as MeToo not just went viral but became a major sort of social and cultural phenomenon. Some states have banned non-disclosure agreements concerning cases of sexual harassment. Other states have introduced new protections for workers, including protecting freelance and contract workers, not just staff employees. The Time's Up Legal Defense Fund has been established. Many millions of dollars have been funneled to poorer and disadvantaged women who want to pursue through law their allegations of sexual violence. Do these to you represent a real step change?
Oh, absolutely. The thing that's happening, I mean, we have miles to go. But these things represent, one, that people are paying attention to the needs of survivors. For instance, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is about making sure that women who could not get legal representation, couldn't afford it in the past so that they could fight some of the sexual harassment cases that they have, now have that. And so that opens up a whole other corridor for people to pursue legal action. There are different steps that people can take, that organizations can take, that corporate America can take, and governments can take. And so every bit that we chip away, every bit that we get, is I count that all as a victory for us.
But Tarana Burke, the problem in some ways is that while you might achieve these significant but relatively small victories, there is something much more overwhelming as a reality in the United States today. You have a president in the White House who we know, thanks to a leaked tape, has in the past carried out abusive sexual harassment.
Yeah.
Not only was he elected with the public knowing that, there is a real chance he may be re-elected.
Don't say that.
Well, that's the political reality.
I know.
And surely that, in terms of what it says about the United States and the political culture and the attitudes to these issues we're discussing today, that says something much more damning and depressing and negative than all of the little steps you're talking about.
Well, one, again, we have to count every step. We're talking about a monumental thing that we have to dismantle. But yes, having somebody in the White House that's a self-proclaimed sexual predator is definitely doesn't make you feel hopeful. But we started an initiative called MeToo Voter this year at the second anniversary of MeToo going viral. And the reason why we did that is because he didn't win by a large margin, and there are millions of people in America who feel very strongly that we should have a different person in the White House for several reasons. One of which is because of his past as a sexual predator. And Me Too Voter is about people who have survived sexual violence being able to stand up and stand in their power and say that I'm not just a victim, I'm a survivor and I'm a constituent.
But isn't there a danger in your entering the political arena with your movement Me Too Voter and other messages? Because just looking at some survey evidence, you are really turning off a lot of white, male, and largely Republican voters. There's one extraordinary YouGov-sponsored survey recently which showed that just 37% of Republican, self-styled Republican men in the US today say that they are now likely to believe women in legal cases which hinge upon the truth of allegations of sexual violence.
I don't know that number would have been different before Me Too.
Well, it has actually gone down over the last couple of years.
I think that
it was over 50%, and now it's just 37% of Republican men say they're inclined to believe women.
I think that the issue that we have around Me Too is people don't understand what the movement is, don't understand what our work is. And so numbers like this come from perceptions that come from the media. There's a perception because the media says, this new person is guilty of this, or this new person is accused of that, and they keep honing in on the individual bad actors. It's one of the reasons why we want to shift the conversation and shift the narrative away from that.
But if all of America was able to look in, for example, on the nomination process in front of senators of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
Every American was able to form their own view of that. And frankly, what people took away from it very much depended on their political perspective. Most Republicans were absolutely sure that Kavanaugh deserved his place on the bench, while most Democrats were equally convinced this was a man not fit to serve.
Yeah.
It's polarized and it's become deeply political.
I mean, I think the country right now is polarized. I think every topic, if you brought up climate change in America, it would be split down the middle by partisan, right? I think that we are in a moment in our country where every topic you bring up, people are going to divide. I have people who send us messages who say, I'm a Republican, I'm a Trump supporter, and I was raped, and I don't support your movement, and I don't believe it. Like, that they would even put aside their own trauma to side politically tells you just how divisive things are in our country. And I think that is about more so what's happening in the country than it is about Me Too.
Here's another way in which I wonder whether you've reflected on how the Me Too movement has evolved over the last couple of years. And that's just a sense that, again, surveys reveal a sense of unease and uncertainty that particularly men have about what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of behaviors with women, particularly in the workplace. For example, again, I'm going to quote you survey evidence. 10% of both men and women say that they are now less willing to hire attractive women. 22% of men, 44% of women predicted that men would be more apt to exclude women from social interactions, such as after-work drinks. Nearly 1 in 3 men thought that they would now be reluctant to have a one-on-one work meeting with a woman. Why is this happening, do you think?
It's because people don't understand what the movement is. This is the thing. We are unearthing something that people really don't want to talk about. We've never had a moment like this in history. We've never had a moment where we've actually had sexual violence on the center stage, where we're looking at the breadth of sexual violence, from sexual harassment to rape and murder, right? We haven't really examined that. Now that we're having these conversations, and women, particularly women, are voicing things that have always been uncomfortable. There's this notion that something has changed, but really nothing has changed except for the fact that people can hear us when we say these things are inappropriate. So now you have people responding to that because we are upending something that has been institutionalized really for so long. People have been able to do what they want to do, say what they want to say, be inappropriate in all kinds of ways without being called on it. Now they're being called on and they're saying, oh my gosh, this is so uncomfortable. When really all women are saying is, I'm asking for you to consent.
This word then that sometimes gets bandied around, that it's gone too far, that some say a witch hunt is now underway. And some of them cite an interesting case, and I just like your views on it. And I know you don't like to get too involved in individual cases, but the one case I'm thinking of is the Democratic Senator Al Franken, who was essentially forced out, required to resign. He felt he was required to resign after a host of women said that he'd behaved inappropriately toward them. Interestingly, even some self-proclaimed feminists, including the lawyer who represented Christine Blasey Ford in her battle with Brett Kavanaugh in front of senators, she said, quote, the allegations leveled against Senator Franken didn't warrant his forced expulsion from the Senate. To treat all allegations the same is not only inappropriate, it feeds a backlash narrative that men are vulnerable to even frivolous allegations by women.
But I don't think our call is not to treat all allegations the same.
Really? Yeah.
No, of course not. It makes no sense to try to dump everybody into one box and say these are the bad people and these are the good people. Sexual violence happens on a spectrum, so accountability should happen on a spectrum, right? The level of things that happen to people vary from, depending on, I could have an experience and another woman have an experience, the exact same experience, and we come away feeling differently about that.
So how did you feel about the resignation of Senator Franken?
Well, I think that was his own decision, right? I think that's not, I'm not here to draw opinions about, whether he should or shouldn't have. He made a decision based on what was happening in his life. But I think the bigger question is that we have to look at what accountability looks like for people. And survivors want accountability in different ways. And we have to shift away from this idea that there's only one way to look at and deal with all sexual violence. I think that's a more appropriate framework for us to work from.
The more we develop this conversation, the more I'm thinking to myself that while we characterize MeToo as largely a movement sort of by women for women, it's only going to work if you really have men with you. And do you think men get it?
Well, first of all, this is the reason why everywhere I go, I try to tell people MeToo is not a women's movement. We are a survivors movement. And I think it's counterproductive to only engage men from the perspective that they are the harm doers and they have to change and they're the perpetrators. Men are also survivors of sexual violence. And so our first engagement with them is from that place. The second point is that men are also wonderful allies. And you're right, we're not going to move the needle at all unless we can engage men and women and however people identify in ways that let them understand how harmful sexual violence is and how we as human beings are responsible for undoing that. So men are very much involved in that and they're very much a part of the solution. This is not a war against men. We can't make the changes that we need to see an end or even an interruption to sexual violence unless we have everybody engaged.
You said to me a little earlier that fundamentally this is about power. It's about the dynamics of power and privilege. You've been at this for decades. It's been your life's work. But how far down this path, along this journey, do you feel yourself to be? I mean, are you still near the beginning, or can you see the end in sight?
I am standing on the shoulders of people who started this fight way before me. And so I see myself as taking the mantle. The baton was passed to me and I'm carrying it even further. So my job is to do more than was done prior to me coming. I think that we are way further along than we were 40 years ago, right? When the first rape crisis centers were opening in the United States and we were just getting to certain kinds of women's lib issues around sexual violence. We're way further advanced than that.
And can you imagine a day when you walk back into a classroom or a refuge in Selma, Alabama, and you ask women and girls whether they have had direct personal experience of sexual violence, and they do not have to write on that piece of paper, "Me Too"? Can you imagine that?
I can imagine that. I can also imagine a day where there's comprehensive sex education that is in curriculums across the country, so that young people who go through school, by the time they graduate, have been hearing about consent and boundaries and respect since they were in kindergarten, and they think differently. And so sexual violence is appalling to them.
Tarana Burke, it's been a pleasure having you on Hard Talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.